it makes me think of the prodigal son. And we know the story of the prodigal son. He said to his father, he says, I want my half of the inheritance. I want out. I want out from under your roof. And you know, our society is a lot like that today, isn't it? You know, we don't need religion anymore. We don't need God. We don't want to be in the Father's house anymore. And that's why only about 20 to 25% of Catholics go to church now compared to 70% about 40 years ago. Don't need to be in the Father's house. And so the boy took his inheritance, which is a symbol of his free will, and he went out, and we know the story, right? He spent it on fast women, fast camels, you know, and he blew it all. And yet he wouldn't come home when he was broke. And then a famine came and struck the land, and yet still the boy wouldn't come home. You know, it makes me think of 9/11 that happened here in this country. And I remember when I was on a concert tour through New York, I accidentally took a wrong turn off on the freeway and ended up right beside Ground Zero. Little cars were honking at me because we were in a big 40-foot motorhome. And there we were right by Ground Zero. And you know, a lot of your fellow Americans have told me, you know, I've heard it time and again that after 9/11 the churches were full. People were coming back, they were praying, they were on their knees. And where are they now? You see, it took much more than just even a famine for that boy to really come home to his senses. You know, it wasn't until he was feeding pigs that boy really started to come to his senses. You see, Jesus was telling this story to Jews. Now imagine if you're a Jew feeding pigs. How many of you have been in a pig barn before? Yeah, it takes about, 15, 20 seconds, and your clothes stink for an hour. It's unbelievable how it just clings to you. I remember once when I was a kid, we went to a pig barn. It was we called the Hutterites. You think you call them the Amish down here, but it was a Hutterite barn, and for 1 week, my coat hung in the garage, and it was just horrible. So you can imagine this young Jewish boy feeding pigs day after day after day, until finally he said, the pigs are eating better than me. What am I doing? I need to go back and say, Father, I have sinned against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son, but just a servant. You see, we need to get to that point in our society, and we're not yet. We're not yet at that point where we come home and we're willing to stay home. And I think we are coming to that point. And I think you all know that. You can see something is going on, right? When you look at the news. And the world seems to be unraveling, doesn't it? It seems to be coming apart. So what in the world is going on? And that's the name of a documentary that I did back in 1997 when I worked for the Canadian Television News Network. It was one of the major city, one of their satellite stations, and I was a news reporter. And I remember my producer, he said to me, you know, we want you to do a documentary, a 30-minute documentary on one of our ethnic groups here in the city. So I thought, you know, I'm Ukrainian, so I thought to myself, well, maybe I'll do something on the Ukrainians. And I was sitting in my chair, and I just thought, wow, that's boring, though. So I went back to my producer, and I said, you know what, Alan? I said, we're looking in the headlines right now, and we can see the headlines are saying, you know, worst storm of the century. Worst flood of the century. Worst earthquake damage ever. I said, but you know, Alan, it's not just in nature that we're seeing chaos. I said, it's also in the social fabric. Worst divorce rate ever. Teenage suicide rate, worst ever. It's epidemic. I said, look at STDs. They're epidemic, according to the Center for Disease Control. In Health Canada, and Canada says it's epidemic. Sexually transmitted diseases in our countries. I said, things are coming apart. I said, why don't we do a documentary? We'll talk to scientists. I said, we'll talk to the religions. We'll talk to the Muslims. We'll talk to the Jews and the Catholics and the Christians. We'll ask them what in the world's going on. And Alan sat there and he looked at me and he said, okay. You know, that documentary, it went on to win Documentary of the Year. And it had some Christian elements in it. And I was accused by fellow workers of this was propaganda. But it was actually the secular establishment that recognized there's something in this. One man watched it, and his daughter told me that he started going back to church after he came home like the prodigal son, because he realized there's something going on in the world. What in the world is going on? Few in the church realize, brothers and sisters, even in the church, that you and I right now, we're living in a time of mercy. Did you know that? We're living in a time of mercy. A time that I think had a beginning and is going to have an end. And if we listen to what's being said in the church by God's prophets, first and foremost the Holy Fathers, I think our time is short. Whatever that means. Whatever that means. But Jesus himself said, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you say, it's going to rain. He said, how is it that you can tell the weather, but you cannot tell the signs of the times? Interesting, right? Jesus rebuking them for talking about the signs of the times. But you know, in the Catholic Church today, in many quarters, if you talk about the end times, you're considered a lunatic. If you talk about Marian apparitions, you're considered a Marian fanatic. And brothers and sisters, that's contrary to what our Lord himself said. You see, when the apostles asked Jesus, they said, Lord, how will we know that the end of the age is coming and the end of the world? You see, brothers and sisters, because Hollywood's got it wrong. The end of the world isn't coming. 2012 is not the end of the world. But what is coming, brothers and sisters, is the end of this age. Our Holy Father himself said we are crossing the threshold of hope. The message tonight is there's hope. He talked about a new springtime. Remember the Holy Father, John Paul II. But tell me, brothers and sisters, what comes before springtime? Winter. You know, funny the conversations that happened in the bathroom, but when I was giving a conference in Maryland, Baltimore, I was standing there in the bathroom using the washroom, and the man beside me struck up a conversation. He said, where are you from? I said, Canada. He goes, oh, Canada. He said, I'm a horticulturist. He said, and you know what? You'd be surprised how much in Canada, your frozen country, how much trees actually grow in the winter. And that was our conversation in the bathroom. And I knew there was a message in that. And it's this, that even though the church right now is entering into the hardest part of her winter, there's growth. You know, I noticed a tree in my yard on our farm. The horses were nibbling at the bark, and so it went into fall, it went into its autumn season faster than the other trees. But you know, now where I'm from, most of the trees have lost their leaves right now in Saskatchewan. And but if you notice the trees, there's new buds already there. Do you know why those buds don't open up right away? It's because it's not the warmth of the weather, although that can sometimes trick trees a little bit. It's the amount of light that the trees are getting. Trees can detect how much light they're getting. As that light decreases as we head to winter, they shed their leaves and new buds start to come. But those buds won't open until the spring, until they get more light. You see, brothers and sisters, it's getting darker and darker in our world. You know, these aren't my words. That's the words of Pope Benedict himself.